Hello everyone and welcome to the shop. I'm Dean and this is going to be a new series on rebuilding the South Bend Heavy 10 lathe. This is kind of what got me started this whole home shop process. Really inspired to do this by Brad Jacobs and Greg Halligan. They've got some phenomenal videos on work that they've done. Brad Jacobs has just done a phenomenal job, gold standard on machinery rebuilding. If you haven't seen his videos, make sure you check them out. Also want to acknowledge and thank him for doing the research on the paint colors. I really like the original colors that South Bend used, and they went through a lot of work trying to match up, and they freely shared the paint codes, which you'll see in the videos. And then also everybody else that's out there, Keith Rucker, Keith Finner, the whole YouTube community for sharing their knowledge. When I started looking for a lathe, South Bend was the first thing I looked for, because I was familiar with the brand and had actually run one when I was in high school. And my buddy's dad had one that we used to mess around with in his garage. So I started looking for information on the internet, and first thing I came across was Keith Finner, and started watching a few of his videos and just immediately got sucked in and started discovering the rest of the YouTube machining community, which is just incredible. So I started looking for a lathe, just watching Craigslist, watching eBay and so forth, not real serious, but just keeping an eye on things. And most of the time they were overpriced, too far out of the area, too big, so on and so forth. But came across this one on Craigslist, and it looked pretty rough, but it was only a half a mile from where I was working that day. So I called the guy up, said, "Hey, you still got it?" "Oh yeah, it's still here." So I swung by on my lunch break and looked at it, and it was pretty rough. Looked at it, they had power, I was able to run the machine. The only thing I could do was run the main spindle. The entire gear train was completely frozen. You could almost shift the quick change gearbox, but not really. Nothing would turn. So it was in pretty tough shape, very filthy, dirty. So I brought it home. It was it was pretty easy to load up. They had a forklift there, and I had a shop crane available here at the house. So I brought it home, and I didn't really have room for it, so it basically sat for 2 years before I could really start working on it, which was actually kind of nice because I was able to spend some time evaluating it, figuring out what I was going to need, and kept an eye on eBay, Craigslist, and so forth, and accumulated a lot of the pieces that were missing and parts that I knew I would need to replace. And so when I finally did have time to start the restoration, I had a lot of the items that I would need, so I could just dive in and go for it. One of the things that I recommend is that get this book. You can pick it up on eBay. I'm sure there's other places you can get it, but it's the Guide to Renovating the South Bend Lathe. And I want to say that probably 80% of the work you can do with just good mechanical knowledge. But the other 20%, especially when you get into the gearbox, the quick change gearbox, the apron, and some of the items on the spindle, you're going to want this book. There's a couple pages in there that are going to save your bacon when you're taking the gearboxes apart and putting them back together. So there's also good information in there just regarding evaluating, and a lot of the information about the different styles and so forth of the south bends that were out there. There's a little bit of the history. Yeah, so after I brought the lathe home, I had to make room for it. So I ended up sat on the side of the house for a whole year. I had it covered up really well. I had to completely rearrange how my shop was laid out. Do a little demolition work and change some of the shelving and cabinets, and just took a lot of work to make space for it. So while I was doing that, I came across a Bridgeport mill, which you saw the earlier series on, and it was one of those deals you couldn't pass up. So I ended up picking up the mill, and now I've stuck with two projects. I got a mill that needs to be rebuilt and a lathe that needs to be rebuilt. So did a little evaluating, and the mill was in much better condition, and I figured I could get that cleaned up and working in a much shorter time period than the lathe. Plus, I already had the lathe stored outside of the shop in well protected, and I didn't have any place to really store the mill. So I figured, well, let's just get it restored, and I can create a spot for it, get it tucked away in a corner. So, the lathe ended up sitting for almost 2 years before I started on it. So my thought process, once I did get started, I knew I was going to have to make some parts. So I tried to start on pieces that wouldn't affect the operation, like the gearbox, lead screw, tailstock, those kind of items, so that if I needed to turn a piece, I could do it. Plus I had the mill if I needed to machine something. The first place that paid off was on the apron. So in the apron, you've got a worm gear in there that drives the gear assembly inside the apron, and the bushings for that worm were worn out, deeply grooved on both ends, and I ended up chucking them up in the lathe, taking a face cut on each of those, and then re-indexing the location holes, to set the backlash. So I was able to do that without the apron on the lathe. I was able to use the lock screw, the apron lock, or not apron lock, saddle lock, excuse me. My tongue entangled there. Use the saddle lock and then feed in with the compound, and I was able to do the facing operation with the lathe partially disassembled. So that actually worked out good. So, and the other thing that helped is I did the two most complicated parts first, the gearbox and the apron. That way I was, the project was still new, had a lot of excitement and focus on detail, and got those parts completed, stored them away back in the back room in the house. Because I don't know how the rest of you are, but when I get close to an end of a project, I want to just get it done. And you start losing some of the detail and some of the enthusiasm. You want to finish the project. So Anybody that's doing one of these, I would recommend doing those two items first. I think it made a big difference. So anyways, let's get started. So I don't know how many parts we're going to have in this series, but it'll be quite a few. And also, as a comparison, excuse me, as a comparison between rebuilding the Bridgeport mill and rebuilding the lathe, the mill was a piece of cake compared to the lathe. The number of parts in the lathe were, a vast number. Just the intricacy of the gearbox and the apron, the headstock, and so forth, the underdrive. There's just an incredible number of parts involved, small parts that take a long time to clean up and detail and repair and so forth. So the Bridgeport only took me 4 months, maybe 5. The lathe took a full year, and I've still got a few things to wrap up on it, but it took a lot longer than I thought it would take. Plus, there's an incredible number of small parts and pieces that you have to paint as well. Where on the mill, everything was just a few large pieces, and pretty much you're done. Yeah. So, anyways, let's dive into it. It's going to be a lot of still photos and bits and pieces of video that I took along the way to assemble together. And I'll chime in from time to time and give some additional narration as we go. All right, well, let's get started. Thanks, guys.
Okay, this is the next project. Actually, this is the first project, the one that started it all, but I haven't had a chance to work on it yet. Yeah, so this is the, I've had it sitting here for 2 years and I just haven't had time to get going on it. I've picked up some items for it. This rear cover was missing. That was an eBay find. I got that, and I've changed the compound. Found a large dial compound that was in better shape than the one that came on this. I threw that on there, and I changed the tailstock. So, as you can see, this thing's really dirty. It's got some issues. I have some parts I've collected. I've got tighten up a few things here in the carriage. There's a lot of slop in the carriage feed here, as you can see how much the hand wheel moves. That's all backlash and gear slop and shaft slop. So I actually have another apron casting on the way. So between this casting and the one that's coming, I need to determine whether or not, I don't know if you can see this or not, but that shaft that drives the rack pinion, it's moving around quite a bit. And there's a lot of play in this one here as well for the hand wheel. Here's the gear train. The gears are all there, not bad. The drive gear here on the spindle is, I have another one. I have one that's much better, but this thing's really tore up. And as you can see, some idiot used a pipe wrench to get the chuck on and off. Okay, the feed selector here, I think it's all right. There's some slop in the gears, but I think they'll be okay. We'll find out when I get them cleaned up. Back gear, let's open this up here. Back gear's in good shape. There's no teeth missing. Goes in and out just fine. Cone pulley looks good. Oh, I forgot to mention, I do have another spindle. I've got a nice, not new but used spindle, but one that's in good shape. So I'll be changing the spindle. I've already got the chuck off. It was stuck on there. I had to really work to get that off, and I made a clamp ring around the end of the back end of the spindle here to hold it, and yeah, she was really on there, but got it broken loose. Okay, and then other issues, the drum switch post, somebody is, I don't know if they heated it up to bend it or just bent it, but they reworked this for vertical and did this Mickey Mouse nonsense up here. And of course the cover's missing. Originally there was a couple of big starter cabinets on the back here. I already removed those. But anyways, I've got a new mount, or a new to me mount, and a good drum switch to put back on there. The taper attachment, everything seems to be there, although it is frozen. But it doesn't seem like it's rusted, you know, because we got a lot of oil on here. I think it's just so dirty and packed with chips that it's just frozen. And hopefully that'll clean up fine. The cross feed lead screw, I'm not sure what condition that's in. The feed nut, or the cross feed nut's definitely going to need replacing. Okay, coming around. Like I mentioned before, I've already replaced the tailstock. I still have the old style tailstock, but it's missing the quill, and I actually was able to get this entire tailstock for the same price as the quill. Let's see if this will move up here. Okay, and then here's something cool. Let's see if we can zoom in. The serial number, and there's the Navy anchor. Yeah, so this came from the Navy. It's got the Department of War effort emblem on here, and moving across here, sorry for the quick camera movement here. We've got the US Navy property emblem here, which is kind of cool. Yep. And it's a single tumbler gearbox. but I think that'll be fine. Lead screw doesn't look too bad. It's just extremely filthy and packed with grease and chips. And then here's the worst part: the bed. There's quite a bit of nicks and scratches and so forth here. There is wear on the ways. I think it's pretty typical for a 1943 lathe, and I think I'm just going to live with it. Got the threading dial. It was frozen, but I got that lubed up and broke loose. It functions. Here's the. This is probably the worst part of the wear right here. How well that's coming out. There we go. Yeah, it's for a hobby lathe. I can I'll probably survive, but yeah, it's unfortunate. It's got quite a bit of wear. Okay, the lower unit. Let's open her up here. It does run, by the way. So, I mean, it's the typical, everything filthy, but the bearings seem okay. I'll put new ones in. Everything turns fine. It's got the original 1943 motor. The terminal box, only half of it was there. I've got it in my parts bin. So if I refurbish this motor and use it, I've got to make the missing half of the terminal box. But I've got other motors. I might put a three-phase motor in and put a VFD drive. Just depends on how things are looking as it's going back together. So anyways, there it is. That's the project. I'm going to get started on here, and it's going to be a lot of cleaning and assessment. All right, guys. So hopefully next time I'm back with you, we'll have some progress.